Good evening. I'm Karen Hunter, and I have the enormous privilege of introducing tonight's panel discussion. I serve as Distinguished Lecturer in the Film and Media Department at Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true 150 years after our founding. I'm also the co-chair of the Public Programs and Conversations Committee of the Presidential Task Force to Advance Racial Equality. Thank you for joining us tonight for the resumption of the online Roosevelt House series we started over the summer, Speaking of Justice. Conversations on race, racism, and reform. This series has featured faculty, scholars, activists, and proud Hunter alum on crucial topics such as the history and impact of protest, monuments and symbols, health equity, code switching, and how to make a career in making a difference. These virtual gatherings have empowered the Hunter community to respond to and advance some of the most urgent conversations happening in our nation today. I want to thank the participants of this program thus far who have helped make this series such a resounding success. Thank you to Hunter Dean of Diversity, John Rose, Vice President for Student Services, and my co-chair on the Presidential Task Force, Misha Smith, Grove Program Manager, Malky Schwartz, and Roosevelt House Director, Harold Holzer, for helping to originate and coordinate this series. And none of this would be possible without the vision, the heart, and the passion of our president, Jennifer Rabb. Thank you. Tonight, we're pleased to continue speaking of justice with a conversation that will tackle head on all of the most important and urgently debated subjects of this national moment in a discussion entitled Policing, Reform, Defund, or Abolish. The panel will address the nature of policing in our communities, including questions surrounding policing alternatives and police accountability, as well as defunding and disbanding the police. Nationwide protests and righteous indignation sparked by the murder of George Floyd have brought with them a passionate and poignant call to end police violence, in particular against communities of color. Across our nation and across the world, people are asking vital questions about policing. Are there different ways to police? Can policing be improved? How much does it cost? And what other constructive community services could these funds support? And how could redirected funds help to build up communities that have so often been criminalized instead? These questions at this moment offer a unique chance to re-examine and reimagine our country's current models of policing, and those models will be explored tonight. To help us do that, we could not have a more distinguished panel. To lead this important discussion, we are pleased to welcome back Hunter's own Dr. Calvin Smiley from the Sociology Department, whose contributions to an earlier discussion of protest movements helped launch the series with such momentum. A scholar of race and inequality and social justice, Dr. Smiley is the co-editor of Prisoner Reentry in the 21st Century, Critical Perspectives of Returning Home. Joining him is Alex Vitale, professor of sociology and coordinator of the groundbreaking Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. Through more than 30 years of writing and commentating, he has established himself as a trusted voice on the problems of policing and potential solutions. His widely published scholarship and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, and Vice News. And his books include City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and The End of Policing. Not only has he shared his essential insights and research in consultation with both police departments and human rights organizations, Professor Vitale has also shared them with the nation on outlets and shows including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, where he has appeared alongside yesterday's Hunter at Home guest speaker, the best-selling author, Michael Denzel Smith. Also joining us is Gloria Brown Marshall, professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where she teaches courses on race and the law, as well as evidence, gender, and justice. She is also a civil rights attorney who has litigated cases for Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Her books include The Voting Rights War, the NAACP, and the ongoing struggle for justice, race, law, and American society, 1607 to present, and most recently she took justice The Black Woman, Law, and Power, 1619 to 1969. Her commentary on the decisions of the Supreme Court has been featured nationwide on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, and NPR, among others. And she is a recipient of many honors, including the Ida B. Wells Barnett Justice Award, the Malcolm X Award, and the NAACP Community Service Award. We are also very pleased to have with us the extraordinary and inspiring community activist and Hunter alum, Beverly Emmers, class of 2019. As a kid in the South Bronx, Beverly dropped out of 9th grade and ended up at Rikers 9 different times for using and selling drugs. Inspired by the birth of her son, Jabari, Beverly overcame immense challenges to graduate from Hunter last year at the age of 49 with a degree in sociology. God bless. So moved was the audience at the packed Madison Square Garden graduation ceremony that she received the evening's loudest standing ovation, louder even than the ovation for the commencement speaker, which was Hillary Clinton, who was among the many standing for Beverly. Beverly, thank you for being a part of tonight's discussion and for sharing your invaluable insight and remarkable story. And now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. And if you want to continue the conversation afterwards, please join one of the breakout sessions afterwards. It's my pleasure to hand over the proceedings to our moderator, Dr. Calvin Smiley.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Professor Hunter, for that introduction. Tonight's discussion will focus broadly on social justice, specifically the role of policing, attitudes towards policing, and how we might envision a future role of policing, or the lack thereof, in America. While this year re-energized protests and demands for an end to racial police violence and police accountability, the narrative is not new. The history of policing in America dates back to the institution of chattel slavery. The unwarranted deaths of citizens, particularly Black Americans, has a long history, from the death of Denzel Dowell in North Richmond, California in 1967 to Oscar Grant in Oakland, California in 2009. While these deaths at the hands of law enforcement only took place 15 miles and 42 years apart, the main difference was the use of recording devices. Without the help of cell phones, Oscar Grant and many other deaths of Black people would have gone unnoticed or undeserving of media attention. Yet these viral videos cannot be ignored. More recently, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old first responder from Louisville, Kentucky, was shot and killed while sleeping after local law enforcement carried out a no-knock warrant. Recently, the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, declined to charge any of the officers involved with shooting and killing Taylor. Only one officer was charged with wanton endangerment for shooting into a neighbor's wall, once again highlighting that in America, property receives more justice than Black life. In the last several days, it has become known that AG Cameron declined to present murder charges to the grand jury, saying that it was, quote, not appropriate to charge these officers. Since May, after the video of George Floyd being killed by Minneapolis police, the release of video showing Ahmaud Arbery being hunted down by white supremacists, and learning of the Breonna Taylor case, protests have occurred throughout the country, from large metropolitan cities to small towns. While symbolic representations of cops kneeling with protesters or yellow paint slogans written on the street, police have continued to use force against demonstrators wearing paramilitary gear and carrying everything from non-lethal to lethal weaponry. At the Tuesday night chaos, otherwise known as the first presidential debate of 2020, Joe Biden and Donald Trump discussed the issues of race in America. This topic immediately went to the role of policing, underscoring America's long association of Blackness with criminality. Donald Trump stated, quote, "We just got the support of 250 military leaders and generals, total support. Law enforcement, almost every law enforcement group in the United States." While he failed to mention it in his rant, Donald Trump has also secured the support of New York Police Department's union, which represents close to 40,000 uniformed officers. Joe Biden, in response to the question, quote, "Do you believe that there is a separate but unequal system of justice for Blacks in this country?" stated, quote, "Yes, there is. There's systemic injustice in this country. But look, the vast majority of police officers are good, decent, honorable men and women. but there are just some bad apples. The perpetuation of the, quote, few bad apples claim contradicts the Department of Justice's findings under the Obama administration that there is systematic discrimination in law enforcement, suggesting this is institutional, not individual. Finally, the issue of policing is part of a larger issue of a punitive culture that has been fostered and integrated into American life over the last 50 plus years. The rise of mass incarceration, which disproportionately impacts Black people and other communities of color, begins with policing, but also shows up in the ways institutions continue to benefit and utilize these systems of exploitation and control. For instance, CUNY and SUNY continue to use products made by CoreCraft, New York State's prison labor industry. In March 2020, a report was released indicating that since 2009, $3.8 million worth of products were purchased by the university system, while CoreCraft paid incarcerated laborers less than $2 an hour. Therefore, while tonight's focus is specifically on policing, we must continue to remember that these systems are interconnected, and we hope that from tonight's discussion, you will take away key points and integrate them into a more robust conversation surrounding criminal justice in America. So tonight, we'll be hearing from a superb panel, and I will direct specific questions towards each of our panelists, as well as more general questions for discussion. I ask that each panelist, for the first part of our conversation, keep his or her response to 5 minutes or less. So to begin, I will turn to Ms. Beverly Emmers. As a mother, activist, and Bronx native, can you discuss and describe how your experiences with the police and law enforcement agencies have informed your approaches to both parenting and community organizing? More specifically, can you tell us about the work you do surrounding policy and art activism?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I just want to thank Hunter College, President Rob, and Roosevelt House for this opportunity and the opportunity to share a panel with such distinguished guests. Well, my experiences, well, you know, in the introduction, it was said that I myself personally came in contact with the criminal justice system. So I have, you know, my own experiences, you know, as a woman, you know, being stopped by police and sometimes them kind of overriding boundaries and, you know, touching me and searching me and things of that nature. But I'm more importantly here to share as a parent, and my experiences has definitely shaped my parenting. And it's just really sad to say, it almost has given me sort of like a paranoia of sorts, a nervousness when my son goes outside. He's now 17. But sometime when my son was younger and in elementary school, you know, there was a lot of shootings in the area. I used to often see police officers corralling boys or locking them up for unlawful assembly, just for being together and going to the park, just unwarranted. And it had made me worrisome because I, a parent, was raising a young boy of color. And then somehow sort of made the correlation between education and crime and policing. Not saying that if you go to school, you won't be a victim of such discriminatory policing, but I had sort of made up my mind, like, you know, if he does well in school and I get him all the things that he needs, maybe I wouldn't be a statistic. And not being educated myself, formally educated, I had began to walk to his school for them to help me help him. And then I had built this relationship inside the school. And there, you know, I began to advocate because they were doing such wonderful things for us as a family. I began to kind of reach out and help other parents. So this parent engagement thing turned into a very transformational experience, because after being in the school and being empowered, they encouraged me to go to school myself. So I took the journey and I wound up going to college, and I just recently graduated, but that was all the result of me being scared of sorts, like just trying to equip myself better. But it was there in school that, taking classes right at the Roosevelt House, I learned about the very system that impacted me and that could possibly impact my son. And I learned about how policing was directly connected to colonialism and slavery and sorts. And I just want to just take to say also that I just feel like this is just full circle. And I just want to take the opportunity to say that, there are a lot of people that change and there are a lot of victims. And so right now people talking about Breonna and George Floyd, but then, next year is going to be a new set of names. There's just always names, going. And I just want to take this opportunity to invoke the name of Kalief Browder. And I just feel a responsibility to speak that because I was the first recipient of the Kalief Browder Memorial Fellowship. And I had the opportunity to meet his mother. And this was another example of what bad policing did. And I'm not going to stay on that, but I just need to invoke his name because we often, forget people, and there's people still doing work for Kalief. And, if you don't know who he is, please look it up. So, just my personal experiences and me being a parent is compelled me to do community work and help, fight the injustice of systematic discrimination. One of the things that I am, that I really feel that my life, even though, I might have went, I feel like it was a purpose, and, my purpose is to advocate for others. I don't know. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing, Ms. Emmers Beverly, who I had the privilege of having in my classes as a student. So I really do appreciate that. We'll go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't like fully because there was the thing I want to talk about. Forgive me, all. This is the first time that I've been on a panel. And I'm going to be very transparent. But so because I believe that parent engagement and the voices of parents need to be incorporated, because a lot of times, people from academia have these conversations about reform and defund, but we need to invite the people that are being impacted the most to share their voices. And so for me, it's parenting. I feel like the one thing that kind of helped is if we empower parents. And currently, I am working on a policy proposal that will soon be introduced to the state. And the parenting engagement, I think that schools and the Human Resource Administration should really partner, because everybody's always talking about parent engagement, but a really honest effort to bring them into the community so they could be more civically engaged and maybe kind of change the lens and change how things are going. But yeah, I mean, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
No, thank you. We really do appreciate that. So I'm going to turn my next question to Professor Brown Marshall. And my question is, as a legal scholar who has written extensively on race and gender in the United States, can you explain and elaborate on some of the historical and significant legal outcomes that have shaped modern day policing? And furthermore, could you provide insight into how the Black woman's body has been over-policed, over-punished, and unfairly misrepresented in the American criminal justice system?
Well, it's going to take 400 years for me to go across the whole number of cases, and I'm going to do so in 3.5 minutes so I can have a minute to sum that up. And we know that last year was the 1619 arrival of Africans into the Virginia colony. It was also in 1619 when the House of Burgesses, the legislative body, was created. So that was created in July of 1619, and 20 Africans arrived from Angola, kidnapped men, women, and children, as hostages taken across the Atlantic, and then they are arrived in the shores of Virginia as at one point servants, another point having some rights. Those women then have this question mark on them. Who are they? All the Africans, who are they? What is their legal designation? Are they indentured servants like the poor whites who came over in 1607 when the colony was founded? So what we begin to see is the use of law to oppress. And they are oppressed because they can compete. This is all about competition. And so when laws were put in place, we have law enforcers. People didn't in the colonies just walk into the stockades. When you have in 1640, John Punch, an African who runs away with 2 Europeans because they're indentured servants treated horribly. When they are captured and brought back, who did that? Law enforcement. So when we think about law enforcement, we have to think about all the different iterations of law enforcement. And that includes bounty hunters. So these Black women then are in a position in which they have had babies by the European. Those children by law now take on the status of the mother by law. So they become enslaved while they are born. And so from here, we see this Black woman's role as the role of the basic anchor of the economy is to continue to create souls that can be sold, that can be used in labor in this country. The Black woman is the core of the economy. If you think about not just the slave trade, but the economy of this country going forward for the next 250 years. But by 1669, there's already a law passed that killing an African is not a felony. So a European killing an African by law in 1669 is not a felony. By 1680, the right of self-defense by an African has been taken away by law. This is how long they have been killing us with impunity, and that we are not supposed to raise a hand to defend ourselves, our families, and others. And the entire time, there are law enforcers. And by 1705, when we have the use of chattel slavery up and down all the different states in this that are part of the North America at that time, we began to see where are the laws, but also I want to point out, and where are the prosecutors? Because we talk about policing, but we don't talk about the prosecutors. We just had this whole idea of Breonna Taylor's murder going without consequence because the prosecutors failed to prosecute. So we go forward both with lack of prosecution and lack of protection by sheriffs and other members of the government. And so we've always had free Africans, and those free Africans are petitioning the government for full rights. This has been taking place this entire time. So by the time we get into, say, the enslavement in America, let's take the case, for example, in 1853 and 54, of Celia, an enslaved woman who's been raped by her slave master at 14 years old, treated as a concubine, who rises up and beats him to death. The police arrest her. She's not allowed to testify in court. Her body belongs to the slave master. She is not allowed to have a right of free speech of her own or to tell what happened in court. She is hanged for his murder. So when we go further into it, we can think of Mary Turner, who was lynched on a bridge, pregnant, 2 children, lynched because she wouldn't tell where her husband was so he could be lynched. When we start talking about a Black woman, we don't even talk about the lynchings that took place in this country. When we go forward, we need to know that there are time and time again instances of Tyisha Miller, who was killed by police, 19 years old in Riverside. And that was in the early 2000s. We need to understand that these things are happening to Black women as well, but Black women are also, like Beverly, the activists, the primary activists who stand up for Black women and men and children. I was one of those people who said that, yes, there are bad apples, but overall, because I teach a number of people going into policing, I know that they are good people to start, but the system is a corrupting system. And this system, as we saw with George Floyd, had this police officer showing him through the murder of George Floyd, training these other 3 officers, one of whom has only been on the force for 48 hours out of the academy. And so they're being trained into the non-formal system of how to be a police officer and how to terrorize the Black community. So when we start talking about policing, we need to talk about the corruption in the prosecutor's office as well, the inability of the prosecutors to do their job to protect the rights of Black men, women, and children, and to understand that force is supposed to be used when facing deadly force. And that's not what's been happening. Force is being used against people of color. But when you see, on the other hand, even the Boston bomber was allowed to give himself up after they knew he had murdered people and wounded so many others. The person in the Aurora Theater who killed people in the dark, he was able to give himself up, stand trial. But to say I have to act because I fear for my life, to fear a Black body, to fear a Black woman, means that no matter what we do, as long as there are no criminal consequences, these murders will continue. And it doesn't matter if it's a Black or white prosecutor, as we see that in the case with Breonna Taylor. What matters is if we don't change the law, we can add more Black people into the system, but it will always be a corrupt system. And I'll end with this. We have had national change, transformation in many of our systems. National change. That's why we had a Voting Rights Act, because we had to excise some of the race-based parts of the voting rights mechanisms nationally. That's why we had to have the Civil Rights Act, because we had to excise the race-based slavery and segregationist parts of employment. And that's why we had the Fair Housing Act, because we had to excise the racism out of our housing. We have not had any national excising of racism out of our criminal justice system. And that's why the system we have needs to be transformed root and branch in order for it to stop identifying itself from the slave masters, slave patrols, bounty hunters, and the corruption of the Bobby system that took place in the 1800s that became our police departments.
Professor Brown Marshall, thank you for that. Just listening to you give about 400 years of history in that amount of time was both amazing and extraordinary. So I want to now turn to Professor Vitale. And my question for you, sir, is in 2017, you published the book, The End of Policing. And some might hear that title as either divisive or just outright scary. And so could you elaborate for the audience what you mean by this? And moreover, what roles do you see local government, police unions, and other community civic organizations playing in retaining the status quo of policing, and how do we get around that?
Well, I'll try to condense an hour's worth of explanation of all those questions into 5 minutes. Professor Brown Marshall setting a strong example for me. So people are afraid. And there's resistance to these ideas. And part of this is because for the last 40, 50 years, so many communities, especially communities of color, have been told there's one resource that government will make available to them to deal with their problems, and that's the police. And so they're given this kind of false choice between the police and nothing. And so when they hear politicians saying defund the police means they're going to take all your police away, they react conservatively. They're like, wait a second, don't take the only thing we have. But that's not really what this movement is about. The movement to rethink policing, defund policing, reinvest to create new models of public safety is really about deeply interrogating what it is that police do, what function police really serve in society, and then developing concrete alternatives that we believe will actually make people safer than they are today, right? This is a public safety movement led mostly, as Beverly said, Ms. Emmers, by people who live in communities where there's not much safety and for whom police have not been a source of safety. We know that most people in highly policed communities don't call the police. Most domestic violence incidents are not called into police. Most criminal matters are not called into police, in part because they view police as a force that doesn't take their concerns seriously, that doesn't actually solve these problems. And even when someone gets arrested and sent to jail, it doesn't really solve the problem that that community is facing. It doesn't really break the cycle of violence. It doesn't really establish strong, healthy communities, which are the real source of safety for people. So instead of turning every social problem under the sun over to police, mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods because of economic precarity, filling our schools with police because we've defunded the schools. We need to look at the kinds of concrete interventions that could produce safety without the collateral consequences of using people with guns or putting human beings into cages. And this means things like bringing back counselors to schools. I mean, here in New York, we have over 5,000 NYPD personnel assigned to New York City schools, which is more than all counselors of all types combined. And this signals how the city views our young people. It doesn't see them as young people who are struggling and need assistance and need to be lifted up. They view them as criminals in the making who need to be controlled and micromanaged. Between 1.5 quarters of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. We've completely defunded mental health systems and then turned the problem over to police who can't possibly properly deal with this problem. We need to bring back community-based mental health services. We need to create non-police, trauma-informed crisis response teams. In Oregon, they have some of these systems. They just released a report. They send non-police clinicians and outreach workers on these calls. They've had 23,000 of these calls in the last several years, and in only 150 out of 23,000 did they need some kind of police backup. In the other 22,850 calls, the civilian outreach workers were able to handle the problem completely. So this is a moment where we need to demand not just this false choice between policing or nothing. Now is the time to demand those things that communities believe will actually make them safer. Why aren't there summer jobs for our young people? Why do we have community centers and public housing developments all over the city sitting empty, unstaffed with no programming? Why don't we have community-based mental health services? Why don't we have drug treatment on demand? Why don't we have counselors in our schools? Why don't we have supports for our families? These are the real ways we're going to make ourselves safer, not giving police implicit bias training.
Thank you for that. Again, a lot of information in a short amount of time. With about our 10 or 11 minutes before we want to open it up to questions for the audience, I'm going to ask 2 questions, and feel free for any of the panels to jump in and answer one or both, or however you feel. So again, the title of tonight's talk is Policing, Reform, Defund, or Abolition. So I just want to say, are these the same or are they different? Which direction do you feel the nation needs to take and why? That's question number 1. And the second question I'll just ask is, as we all know, 2020 has been nothing short of exhausting. Between the global pandemic of COVID, continued police violence, the looming Supreme Court hearings, and all capping off of the presidential election in early November, where we know that the sitting president has essentially told Americans that he's not going to concede. So many of us are feeling helpless and hopeless. What are the prospects for making meaningful change in policing, law enforcement, or just other justice systems?
I think Alex probably wants us to jump in on this too, but I believe in litigation, legislation, protest. This trifecta is what I put forward as often as possible. And that is what's really fueled social change in this country. All three, but with a vision, because without vision, the people perish. So I think there needs to be continued litigation. I think we need to continue to put policing and prosecution together. When you use the word policing by itself, it's really very narrow, because you could have all of the policy changes you want, but if they don't follow the policy, you're going to need to litigate, or you're going to need to bring criminal consequences to these police officers. Once some of them start going to prison, I think you will begin to see the change. Once again, you need national reform and legislation, but you also need the protests, because the protests will keep the heat on, the protests will keep the issue in the news, and the protests will remind people why we are here. And Kalief Browder's case was not just a policing case, it was a prosecution case as well. And until we start thinking about how the prosecution has failed us, and the way in which they are allowed to fail us and still keep their government jobs, because only the DA runs for office. Everybody else is getting the government paycheck. So we are not just paying for the salaries of those police officers, we're also paying the salaries of those prosecutors who are not doing their jobs well enough.
I'd like to just respond and comment on this. Yes, policing, everything is interconnected and everything needs to sort of like be addressed simultaneously. Reform, defund, they're all different. But I think that only until we look at why police was created and get down to the root of it, it needs to simultaneously happen. And I just want to just kind of comment on what Mr. Vitelli said when he talked about mental illness in our communities and how often there's a bad interaction. You know, even our food, a lot of the food that we have in our communities is contributing to that mental illness and the post-traumatic stress disorder of just always kind of being on guard when you're walking down the street. But it all has to change simultaneously. And, you know, just the other day, this rapper, Ice Cube, you know, he introduced an idea of police being insured, right? Because whenever, you know, there's a crime, they don't go to jail, but then the city or the state, wherever it happens, they have to pay a lawsuit that taxpayers are paying into. And I just think the idea of police having insurance themselves, so when this happens, they're paying financially for this. It shouldn't only be on the backs of citizens, but the whole system needs a overhaul. The whole system.
Yeah, that's for sure. There needs to be an overhaul, but I think the focus needs to be on the scope and intensity of policing, rather than thinking we can turn police into officer friendly. You know, after the police killed Eric Garner on Staten Island, the mayor said, don't worry, we're going to fix this. We're going to give everyone in the NYPD implicit bias training and de-escalation training. And that's what they've been doing for years. They've paid millions of dollars for this training. And guess what? It doesn't work. Makes no difference, right? Has anyone seen any police de-escalation in the last 5 years? Much less over this summer of protests we just witnessed? I certainly didn't see any de-escalation happening. The city's own evaluation of the implicit bias training showed that it had absolutely zero effect on officer behavior. Officers said their minds were changed when they filled out the little evaluation form, but then when they actually measured officer behavior, nothing. Because how could this possibly fix the problems of race and policing in the United States? To imagine that it's completely unconscious and unintentional individual discretionary officer decision-making that's a problem here. This is built into the system. It's built into the mission of policing. When our elected officials, like the mayor, tell the police to wage a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on gangs and a war on disorder and a war on homeless people, the police are not going to be friendly. They're not going to be respectful, but they are going to be violent, and that is going to fall disproportionately always on the most vulnerable communities in our city. And so we have to demand political accountability. not just police accountability. The police didn't create the war on drugs. The police didn't defund the schools. The police didn't defund health services. These were political decisions. And people like Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo have never seen a problem they didn't want to turn over to the police. The governor's like, well, we could open up some restaurants under COVID, but only if we hire a huge new army of police to go around enforcing, every problem has to be solved through penalties, punitiveness, violence. And this is the mindset we have to get out of.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, one thing that I see is the issue of police unions, right? As a laborer myself, as part of PSC CUNY, I'm pro-labor, or pro-labor unions, but what role does the police unions take in not allowing effective change? Because the only thing I hear is when crime goes up, the police say, well, we need more cops because crime's gone up. When crime goes down, they say, well, we need more cops because that's what's working effectively. So what role do police unions play in not allowing change to occur?
I mean, they're a major obstacle to change because, and I just have to go back to something that Alex said. I don't know why people are afraid to prosecute police officers and send bad police officers to prison. We can just, the reason why implicit bias is going to work with people who are open to actually change. We have a system by which any other area, when people commit a crime, the nature of which we've been seeing over 1,000 people killed by police every year, that we've been able to register this. And it's only the media that's been able to give us those numbers. The FBI was not even keeping those numbers. But we're always hesitant. We've made police into celebrities. And so their ability and their unions and the way in which we speak of police and this, it's just so elevated that we really can't seem to bear the thought of a police officer going to prison based on a race-based murder. Or as we've seen in other instances, even if it's a situation like the one in Brooklyn, where it was a supposed accident, if a civilian had committed that same type of accident and killing somebody, opening the door on their roof, they would have some criminal consequences. And so I really think the idea of not prosecuting police, because once we start doing that, I believe there will be some changes. And it's just like with every other area that's race-based in this country, once people start having real consequence to their race-based issues, you don't have to love me, but it'll stop your behavior if you know that you're going to have a consequence to that behavior. And right now, we're not giving them any consequence.
Well, I wish I shared your optimism about the legal system as a tool for fixing this. I mean, my sense is that the legal system was created to enable exactly this behavior, and that's part of the reason why these prosecutions, A, don't happen, and B, don't lead to the positive outcomes that you imagine. And my concern also is that it rests on this same theory of punishment as the tool for making change. And I don't think this is going to work with police any more than it works with getting rid of drugs. So there needs to be accountability. And I think that accountability is to get people out of the police business. It's to demand that we actually do something about racial injustice, about the systematic defunding of schools in Black communities, about systematic racial discrimination in hiring and in housing. These are the kinds of things that I think are going to really address the problem. As for police unions, I'm not interested in breaking unions. I'm interested in breaking their political power. We have to they've gotten a pass, like they're just any other municipal union, like the teachers union or the sanitation union, but they're not. They stand for a toxic, racist politics that says that the solution to every problem is someone with a gun, and that certain people only understand punishment as a way to change their behavior. And this is at root a racist worldview that these unions are deeply committed to. And we have to make any politician who takes their money or endorsement pay for the consequences of that. Because it's my view that any politician who takes their money or endorsement cannot be our friend, is canceled. I'm happy to say it, they're canceled, right? That runs diametrically opposite to any kind of potential for a more progressive politics around race and economic inequality in the United States. And so that's I think the strategy about how we reduce police union power.
I guess I don't understand how we're supposed to save Black lives if police are not going to prison. And if the prosecutor's office is not going to prosecute. I just don't understand how those two things happen. How is this change supposed to take place with racial bias just by magic? I mean, in the meantime, we have police officers who are killing people. We have a standard that says that prosecutors, as in the Breonna Taylor case, aren't even bringing the issue to the grand jury. So then how can we force the prosecutor's office to actually do its job and protect Black lives and work and advocate on behalf of Black victims if we're not even willing to actually think about the role that the criminal justice system can play? It's not going to be the panacea to cure all, but it does have to play a role in order for change to happen. I'm not saying it's going to be the only role, but I don't see the discussion that it even plays a role.
Thank you. So at this point, I appreciate all of the comments and discussion that we've had so far. I'm going to turn it over to Mac so we can start to get some of the questions from the audience, which it looks like there's a bunch. So you're on, Mac.
Thank you, Calvin. Yes, there are many questions, and I will share a few of them with you now. First, from Doug Phelan. Could Professor Vitale speak a little more about implicit bias training and evidence of its or lack of effectiveness?
Yeah, so implicit bias training rests on this idea that racism is in part something that is unconscious and unintentional, and that we can measure this by, giving people little buttons to push and putting them in front of a screen and showing them different images, and we find these little millisecond differences in their behavior. This research itself is deeply problematic, but more importantly, they've never shown ever any connection between how people score in the test and how they behave. They've never shown any evidence that any of this training that police receives makes any difference. And the New York Times just published a story in the last month about New York City's own attempts to implement this that show that it just makes no difference. Officers find it ridiculous and insulting. And in fact, some research shows that after they've been subjected to this ridiculous training, racial bias incidents get worse. And this is also true in business settings. This is not going to fix the problems of racism in the United States. Just think about, in a business setting, who's paying for this diversity training? The boss is, the head of the institution is. So is that diversity trainer going to come in and talk about the structural racism of that institution, or the role that the boss plays in reproducing racial inequality in hiring, promotion, or business practices towards the public? Absolutely not. They make it about, well, you said something funny to me at the water cooler, or you looked at me funny in a meeting. It's about blaming the employees against each other. And yes, there are problems at that level, of course, but it lets management completely off the hook.
Anybody else care to speak to that before we move on? Okay, next question from Dave Bassnett. How do you make visions of an abolitionist future digestible for those who cannot reflect on our systems with a critical lens? In our collective envisioning of a world without police, what do you think is the root of people's hesitation to usher in that new world? How can we change hearts and minds?
I'll say very quickly, our police force is one that framed from the southern most parts of the country as part of slave patrols and night riders. I've actually seen police badges with a KKK number on the other side of the badge. We need to stop playing with this institution. This was an institution that was created from most, not the Northeast as much, but for the rest of the country as part of slave patrols and a militia to put down Native American uprisings up and through the 1800s. And then the Bobbies of England were incorporated into this and made our police departments that we have into the 1900s. We need to understand that it was an institution based in racism and slavery and Jim Crow segregation that was meant to protect white people from people of color. It is an oppressive institution, nationally based, that's never been reformed. As I told you, other institutions have been reformed. So first and foremost, we need to know what we're dealing with here. And when I've talked to police officers about that, most of them don't even know that's how policing began, because the policing courses don't even talk about this issue. They start with the Bobbies of the 1800s and from England and move on from there and leave out the racist past of policing and the core root of it. So once we start actually having this conversation about where our police force came and the fact that it has not had any real national reform around race, we began to see that perhaps there is room for improvement, since we've improved voting rights and employment and housing. And when we compare it to other institutions, I think we have a better idea that it becomes more digestible and people can better understand where we're coming from and where we need to go.
You know, the Bobbies were created in 1829 in London by Sir Robert Peel, Bob, the Bobbies. But what people never talk about, like they never talk about policing and slavery, they never talk about the fact that Robert Peel gets this idea from colonialism. He's in charge of the English occupation of Ireland, and that's where he develops the police idea, which he then brings back to London when he becomes Home Secretary. In terms of how do we talk about these big vision things, I think we have to try to make it practical and concrete. That's my view. You know, as a former community organizer, labor organizer, you got to reach people where they are. They may know there are harms to policing, but they don't necessarily know what the alternative might look like. So I often say, look, police abolition doesn't mean tomorrow we find some magic switch which doesn't exist and we just flip it off and then poof, all police are gone. Right? That's what Donald Trump wants you to think it means. Oh my God, tomorrow there are no police and everyone will run wild in the streets. This is about a process of directly interrogating what we use police for, why that's a bad idea, and what the alternatives would look like. And what that looks like is going to city council hearings, lobbying around the budget, saying, no, we don't want more money for police military gear. We want money for drug treatment services. We don't want more money for school police. We want more counselors. And then we see where that process leads us. And when we understand that policing has always been a tool for reproducing inequality, we don't make the mistake of thinking that it can be fixed with implicit bias training or body cameras.
Hunter, Professor Michael Lewis has a good question here. He says, the proposal to more narrowly focus police responsibility resonates. Yes, mental health and school safety and substance addiction should not be in their domain. But what would you say should be the proper focus function of police?
I don't think we know the answer to that, because it's not just about like the soft things. There's an excellent new book by Lee Goodmark at the University of Maryland called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, that's filled with strategies for getting domestic violence out of the criminal justice system, which in her 23 years of experience running a domestic violence clinic, she says has been a 100% total failure that has endangered the lives of women and children, that has made their lives worse, not better. So we need to get police out of the domestic violence business, out of the youth violence business. We need to bring in credible messenger programs, violence interrupters, cure violence models. In New York City, we did a gold standard study, an experimental study where we paired neighborhoods with similar demographics. Some got a cure violence program and some didn't. And the cure violence neighborhoods had dramatic reductions in gun violence. Sometimes 50% reductions in gun violence compared to almost no change in the control neighborhoods, right? When these programs are well funded and well run, they work dramatically better than policing. So maybe at the end of this, we need some way to respond to, you know, armed bank robbers and career embezzlers and Enron executives and people who crash the economy, right? Maybe we need something to do that, but it's not going to look very much like what we have today.
I would like to say, there was something that was said earlier about policing in certain communities. I may not live in a community people might think is overly policed, but I fear for my life too. I fear for my relatives and I fear for my friends. When you're Black in America, you fear for your life wherever you are. And what really concerns me is like that answer to that question is, I want the policing that white people get. I want the policing they have in the white community in Long Island, where you call the police because you have something you can't control. There are vigilante groups out there. You know, we've already had in our debate, we saw the presidential debate, that there are vigilante groups well armed, the same way we had the militia groups before, and that's where they see themselves as the people who are meant to put down people of color from getting out of their place. So there are people, I'm sure, within the policing departments of the 18,000 police jurisdictions around this country who are also parts of those organizations. My concern is if the standard is one in which we have to transition to it, then envision the type of policing in a white suburb, and that's the kind of policing I'll take for right now until we have the one that we need to have in place.
I would like to add in addition to thinking about what precincts should look like, I think we also should look at those community complaint boards that are sort of put in place to review and to look at cases when police are mistreating constituents. You know, just an example here in New York City, they're actually appointed. We should have those mechanisms where people are elected and able to prosecute. Because how could we expect the system to prosecute itself? So I would like to see that in the future.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of this part of our evening, so I'll ask one more. This questioner didn't provide a name, but she refers to you, Gloria, as a friend. Oh, is this, maybe it's Kevin Nesbitt, and acknowledges you too, Calvin, and you as well, Bev. So, sorry, my question is, as we approach a multi-layered system to address these issues, can we talk about the efficacy of community policing? And when done well, what does success look like?
I'm just going to jump in, and then I think Beverly and Alex are probably 30 seconds. Success looks like I don't fear for my life. Success looks like I have an opportunity when I need police, and I've not called police when I've desperately needed them for this very reason. It's more dangerous for somebody like me to call the police than not. And so I think that for me to be safe with my police officer is what community policing looks like, for me to actually perhaps know who they are, and for them to understand that they are government employees paid for by my tax money, and that I should be able to interact with them in a way that's human and not one in which they are looking at me as the enemy.
Well, I'd like to share, I actually witnessed one day there was a whole melee of teenagers across the street having a fight. And normally when police come, they'll just lock everybody up. They don't ask no questions. And it was some good policing that day because I witnessed them de-escalate. They talked to the teenagers. They didn't lock them up. And then, you know, I went back to the window to peek out again, and they were all sort of like eating ice cream. I know that may be unrealistic, but this is something that I witnessed. And those same officers, they walk around the neighborhood and they try to interact, but then again, it's really it's really strange because sometimes you don't even want to be seen talking to them. But there are some officers that are trying, and I was fortunate to witness that.
To me, this is not about the motives of officers or really the particular system. I mean, my problem with community policing is that it's predicated on the idea that the community brings its problems to the police for the police to work out. And it tries to do this with more community input, community respect, et cetera. But what tools do police have to solve community problems? Guns, ticket books, handcuffs, threats, coercion, violence. They don't have access to housing. They don't have access to mental health services. They don't have access to jobs for young people. They don't have access to any of the things that would actually make these communities safer and stronger. And every single dollar that goes into creating this possibly imaginary, helpful police department is a dollar that we can't have to do any of those other things. And after 30 years of studying policing, I have no faith in creating a police department whose primary mission is actually to produce safety in Black and brown communities. We have to produce safety. We have to deal with those young people in other ways. If we don't want violence, if we don't want racism, we should not get the police involved, because there is no policing without those things. And in the 200 years of history, there has never been policing without those things. So we've got to get away from this idea that we're going to create some mythical officer friendly. And let me say, policing in white suburban neighborhoods, not good either. White people mostly don't complain about it because they just have nothing to do with the police. But when they do, they're not very happy with how that policing is carried out.
Calvin, panelists, any quick final thought before Misha Smith comes on to tell us about the breakout rooms?
I just wish that we could actually know whether or not we're going to get officer friendly or officer deadly. And that becomes the question. Well, I also know that there are people who go into policing to help others. I know this. What the system does to them,
but it's irrelevant.
But for you it is. For me, it means something, because that means the system itself is corrupting them once they get into it. And that's why I said, once again, in the Derek Chauvin case, he was training those 3 new recruits from the academy on how to terrorize the Black community. So even if you had a good heart and a good reason to go into policing, the system has been so corrupted without any national reform or transformation that it's nearly impossible not to get tainted.
But let's hire those young people to work in community centers, not in policing. They'll do much more to help their communities, and they won't kill anyone.
I'll just say, I want to thank the panelists for their insight. This, I think, was a great panel discussion. I think everyone brought different ideas to the table. We're not going to solve it tonight. But again, we should strive for abolition. We didn't strive for slave reform. We didn't strive for letting slaves only work 9 to 5. It took time. It took a lot of energy. It took a lot of organizing. It took a lot of debate, discussion. So I just want to end on that, you know, we'll get there. So thank you, Professor Vitale, Professor Gloria Brown Marshall, Ms. Beverly Emmers. This was great. Thank you, Hunter.
Thanks, Calvin.